got a meeting in 10 minutes. We need support 24/7.
In terms of all of our Christian religions, Catholicism basically has the fundamental belief in Christ, a belief that he came to save us from our sins, and a belief that we need to have faith in him in order to have salvation. What sets us apart, I think, is our tradition of sacraments. Basically, a lot of the way that we express our communal worship involves ritual.
Every St. John's Eve, June 23rd, ceremonies are done in New Orleans. St. John's Eve has become a very important voodoo day, and it's all about cleansing. Just like John the Baptist cleansed and baptized people, you'll see a lot of that going on. You'll see a lot of cleaning of the head going on. You'll see probably a big bowl with water and herbs and flowers in it, and you'll see people being cleaned with that. And it's all about, rebirth and cleansing your spirit and starting over, recommitting to your faith, recommitting to yourself.
For centuries, the Catholic Church has been a powerful worldwide force, not only spiritually, but politically, economically, and socially. Voodoo, while far less influential on the global stage, has followers around the world as well. In the United States, it has long been shrouded in mystery and superstition. So it may come as a surprise to many that voodoo and Catholicism share an interesting history. Here in New Orleans, along the banks of the bayou, both voodoo and Catholicism enjoy enormous support from legions of ardent followers.
I think New Orleans has a very rich spiritual history. First of all, because of our largely Catholic French roots, there is definitely a predominance of that religion or that faith background here in the city. Also, I think that in a city that is as richly diverse as we are, you have people coming from a variety of ethnic backgrounds and whatnot, yet they can find a commonality in their practiced faith.
We've had white people, Creole people, practicing voodoo. We're borrowing things from each other until we get a little mix going on that's a mix of traditions, a mix of cultures, a mix of spiritual ideas, and a mix of races, all going together in a big pot of gumbo. And that's what New Orleans voodoo is really all about.
While voodoo is practiced with fervent enthusiasm by many residents of New Orleans, its origins can be traced to a distant continent thousands of miles away.
It's a spiritual path that came to the New World via the slave trade. And the African slaves were not allowed to practice their own religion. Many elements of their own culture were disallowed when they were taken as slaves to the New World. So they did some pretty interesting things to cover up the practice. There were a lot of Catholic missionaries around at that time trying to kind of push those views on the slaves. So they actually saw some elements of their own religion of voodoo, their own spiritual path of voodoo in Catholicism.
That early connection between Catholicism and voodoo remains strong to this day.
A lot of people have used voodoo to pick up where traditional Catholic religion or Christianity might not have an expression. Voodoo came in with its own flavors and said, so how can we make ourselves a little bit more appealing? How can we relate to those who are of one faith and yet offer them something else? And I think that that's where the history of the two come together, where the history of bringing some of the saints and whatnot into the voodoo practices and whatnot, with their own special twist.
The great voodoo queen Marie Laveau did a whole lot to help the relationship between Catholics and voodoo practitioners. Marie Laveau used to say, especially when she got older, she became a much more devout Catholic. And she used to tell her ritualists, don't come to my ritual on Friday or Saturday if you're not planning to go to church on Sunday. And if you weren't at church on Sunday, don't plan on attending my rituals on Friday or Saturday evening.
Like most religions, both Catholicism and voodoo define themselves, at least in part, by their respective rituals and traditions. These, of course, differ from one religion to the next. What is remarkably consistent, though, is the role that virtually all religions play in the lives of their followers.
I would say the basic function of religion, both for individuals and for larger groups of human beings, is to create an order of meaning within which human life makes sense. Now, that certainly involves questions of death, of suffering, of evil. But not only, it also involves sort of rather basic questions, why should we do this and not the other? It involves questions of morality.
And in many cases, it involves faith, allowing people to rise above some of life's most demanding challenges.
And by the time I had Michael, he was such a sick baby. It was a really life and death situation with him. He was really, really bad. And sometimes you think that he wouldn't make it, you know. He stayed 18 days in ICU. And I remember one night I actually came home, and I remember it was a Sunday. And I know everybody in my church prayed. We had fasting going on at the time at the church. And I heard everybody, whether it was 6 o'clock in the morning, they were praying for him. Whether it was 12 o'clock in the day, they were praying for him nighttime. I remember this particular night I came home and I was ironing my clothes to go to church the Sunday morning. And I remember praying and I said, Lord Father, I went through 9 months of being pregnant and you didn't take him then. I said, you're going to take him now? If I did anything wrong, don't let my child pay for the wrong things that I did in life, you know? And I remember talking to God that night, and to me, it seems like after that night, that's when my son made 100% improvement. Because once he started to recover and he came out of ICU, he just picked up to this present day. So that's why I believe that sometimes prayer do work.
The enormous role played by religion in the U.S. is certainly nothing new. In fact, religion has been a major component of the American cultural landscape since the very beginning of the Republic.
Many of the early people who came here were very devoutly religious and in fact came for religious purposes, wanted to set up religious colonies that would be governed by theistic rules and by the clergy, and the church would be right at the center of the community. Others of the people who came here either wanted diversity and freedom or wanted to be shed of religion, thank you very much, and came because they thought they would achieve a kind of freedom from all of those religious constraints. So we've kind of gone back and forth. The 1950s were a real all-time high of people affiliating with religious communities, attending on a regular basis, in large measure because we had an all-time high of families with young children. And over the course of American history, there's been a very strong kind of cultural norm that has said, if you're a family and you've got young children, that's the time in your life when, if you're ever going to affiliate, you better do it now.
Someone said that American religion is a mile wide and an inch thick, and I think that pretty well sums it up. We know that a lot of people take their religion fairly easily. It doesn't lead them to live their lives a different way, or they go to religious services once a month or once every 3 months instead of every weekend.
Few would dispute the notion that the practice of religion in the United States has varied over time, but its impact and influence have never wavered.
Certainly one of the striking things about American life of the last half century has been the persistence of religion. The extent to which, if you look at what people say they believe, and if you look at the reports on their behavior, they are as religiously involved as their grandfathers and grandmothers were in an earlier generation. And that is a striking feature of American society. It really distinguishes us from other societies in the Western world. So that Americans today are as likely or more likely to say, for instance, they believe in life after death, are about as likely to belong to churches, go to church on Sundays regularly, as was true 30, 40 years ago.
Now, one has to add to this that it's not the same in every group. Like the Protestant scene, the so-called mainline Protestant churches have experienced decline in membership, while other groups, like evangelical Protestants, have burgeoned. But the country as a whole, no, I don't think it's any less religious than it was, say, 50 years ago.
Well, Americans have always been religious, always will be. But the forms it takes are going to shift, and we should just prepare for that. We shouldn't grieve that there's a shift coming up. Of course there'll be shifts, because the whole way of life is changing. Life is not the same as it was 100 years ago in the United States.
It's the civil rights movement, the student protest movement on college campuses, and then the women's movement, along with the protests against Vietnam. What they all had the consequence of doing was undermining the authority structure of the several institutions of our society. Certainly by 1972, when Watergate was exploding, we had a society in which young people had become highly disillusioned.
And if you look at the polls, the credibility of our institutions started going down then and actually has not come back up. And so part of it was loss of credibility in the church as a voice. Also, when there's fewer children, there's going to be lower level of church involvement. And if you look at the birth rates for Protestants went down quite a bit in the 60s.
Cynicism about venerable institutions, a declining birth rate. Clearly, these kinds of changes have drastically altered the tapestry of American society. But there have been many other changes as well.
Now we have more pluralism. We have more religious groups in the United States which are active and visible and have a claim on the public sphere. This is unprecedented. So the sense that we're living in a pluralistic nation, which actually resembles the pluralistic world.
And while many still point to America's Judeo-Christian heritage as the linchpin of U.S. religious tradition, the number of Americans practicing other religions is steadily increasing.
Today we have, obviously, a whole variety of other religious traditions present in American culture, many of whom have been here for a long time but are now in much greater numbers since the 1965 immigration laws changed. So we have Hindus and Buddhists and many, many Muslims, of course, and Sikhs and all sorts of other groups that have come in with the new waves of immigrants in this country.
With this increase in diversity has come an increase in religious tolerance.
It used to be the case, for instance, that a majority of Americans would say that they wouldn't vote for a Jew or a Catholic for president, and now almost everybody says they would. It used to be the case that on surveys, Americans would say that people had to be Christians in order to be good people or to be saved, and they tend not to say that now. Americans in the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, have an interesting combination of being religious people, but who seem to accept other people's religion, even if it's a different theology than their own.
Not only are most Americans more tolerant of religious diversity than ever before, but in a growing number of cases, their concept of spirituality now transcends specific religious affiliation.
That is, if I ask you, are you Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, or something else, you say, nothing. You know, there's no sense of identification with a religious tradition. That, up until the 1990s, was somewhere in the vicinity of 7-8%. Really small percentage of the population that said they had no preference. It's more like 15% now. And that's a really significant change. Interestingly, most of those people who say they have no religious preference are not really unbelievers. They still say they believe in God, Most of them say they pray at least occasionally. Many of them actually attend services once in a while. So it's an interesting new kind of phenomenon in American society that there's a significant segment of the society that just says organized religion as we know it, all of those identities that are out there, is not for me. But I still want to consider myself at least somewhat spiritual or believing.
I think the key thing that's happening is that people have come to make a kind of a distinction in their mind between being spiritual and being religious. And being religious, for the most part, means that they have affiliated with some traditional or even new kind of religious movement.
Usually they are connecting with a particular religious tradition, and they honor its beliefs and its rituals, its practices. Whereas if someone says, I'm spiritual, they usually are talking about their inner self, how they feel, how they think about what's important in their life, and how they feel about their connections, the connections of themselves to the larger world. And that is not necessarily a religious language.
Being spiritual means that they may not go to church at all, but they're attuned to a variety of religious messages that they see in the environment around them. It might be an experience in nature, it might be all kinds of ways that they express that, all the sorts of ways that we associate with New Age religion, astrology, or practicing yoga, and that kind of thing.
The choice of moving away from organized religion is more frequently made by young people than by their elders.
Spirituality is our individual relationship with our Creator. Very often, religion doesn't address that for young people. I don't want to negate religious efforts to engage young people through certain churches. I don't want to negate that at all, but by and large, the perception is that there's no room for you. Very often, when the front door to the heart is closed off to God, the back door may be open, and it may come to the young person through popular culture, through a celebration of dance and music. Some people might be experiencing God on the floor of a rave, dancing and reaching up through music to experience a higher self or a higher power.
So we're living in a culture of picking and choosing from a variety of sources to deal with our thinking about faith and our thinking of who we are and how to enrich our lives. I think Americans are very much wanting to enrich their sense of life and of who they are, and to discover something about themselves that's authentic and real.
For many Americans, that quest for authenticity has led them not to the video arcade or the nature trail, but in a very different direction.
Evangelical Christianity has grown and continues to grow in large part because it offers answers to people's questions. Many churches, more on the liberal side, have failed to provide satisfactory answers. They offer more tentative kinds of answers, whereas the evangelical Christian, more conservative communities often point to solid, traditional answers to perplexing questions. And I think one of the marks of our time is this quest for certainty, for sure answers about life's big dilemmas. Whether that's an issue like abortion, pro-choice, pro-life, people want a yes or no answer. And evangelical Christianity, whether you like the answers or not, it's a different question, but they offer answers.
And with answers in hand, religious organizations often seek to turn their ideas into action within the political arena.
Part of our heritage in the U.S. of having this voluntary religious system is also a heritage of having the ability to form various kinds of special purpose groups and social movements and so forth. So if you go back into, say, the 19th century, you had people forming temperance organizations, abolition organizations, women's suffrage organizations. Now, those all, on the face of it, seem to be secular social movements. But what you found when you go back and look at who was organizing and how they were organizing, they were very closely tied to religious organizations. So it really isn't a new thing to see groups of Catholics who are worried about abortion, or groups of conservative Christians who are worried about abortion or about pornography or any of a number of other things, and forming a moral majority or a focus on the family or whatever that is a voluntary organization that says we're concerned about these things, we're religious people, we bring that religious perspective to bear on wanting to do something different in our society.
Conservative Christian groups have received perhaps the most attention in recent years for their efforts at mobilizing members towards a common political goal. But this is something that many other religious organizations also do, often with great success.
One of the groups that has been most effective in American history at mobilizing people politically is actually these African American Protestant churches. They're effective because they are bringing people together in a community where people really understand the importance of the bonds that they have with each other, the importance of this community to their well-being. And they also understand that this religious community, this congregation, is a place that's going to be concerned with every aspect of their lives. The Black church has been so central for the Black community, in large measure because for many years it was the only institution that African American people controlled. So it has that kind of heritage and that institutional strength that has made it a very effective mobilizer.
Religious organizations have long played a role in the U.S. political process. This despite the fact that the relationship between church and state in America has always been very controversial.
And in the United States, there has been a very long tradition, certainly since the establishment of independence, of having a separation between church and state. I think what has happened is that the federal courts have increasingly had a narrower concept of what the separation means. Not only that the state does not discriminate one religious group as against another, but that the public sphere must be antiseptically clean of religion. And that many people resent.
Nowhere is that resentment more apparent than in the frequently heated debate over school prayer.
And the point there really is that the schools are an arm of the society as a whole. They do express a kind of authority over the kids that are in those schools. And when the state says, okay, everybody has to engage in something in the classroom, the moment of silence, whatever, what people who are not believers will respond is, you're presuming that I believe in somebody I'm going to talk to during that moment of silence. There's a kind of coercion going on there.
And so the debate rages on. And given the depth of feeling many people have about both religion and politics, the level of intensity is not likely to abate anytime soon.
Religion is the language of absolutes, of absolute values, of absolute images of the self, of absolute convictions. And so whenever one deals in religious rhetoric, one deals, in a sense, with extremes.
Religion's a hot-button topic, mainly because when you use the word religion, you imply something that connects with God or the sacred or whatever your word to describe that which is ultimate. And people want to believe strongly in something that grounds them, something that's important, something that is an anchor in their lives. So when they encounter someone who thinks differently, that is a kind of threat to one's sense of ultimacy.
There are those who contend that a kind of cultural divide, based in part on differing religious beliefs, has fractured U.S. society into two distinct and very hostile camps. Not everyone agrees, however.
All of the sociological evidence says that on most social issues, we are not more polarized than we were, say, 30 years ago. That what we've seen is an increasing polarization of the rhetoric of the most visible people.
What you have is you have a very sharp conflict between two activist groups. which could be, you can give them different names, say traditional or conservative on the one hand, progressive on the other. And they are in sharp conflict over a number of issues, such as abortion, such as homosexuality, etc. Most people are somewhere in the middle. They have feelings this way or that way, but they are not terribly passionate about it.
Polarized or not, the United States, like most nations, is clearly undergoing a great deal of very rapid and profound change. And while religious practices and beliefs are certainly not immune to that process, religion in some form seems likely to endure.
It will certainly change its forms. That goes with human beings in a rapidly changing world. But something called religious will remain with us because it addresses the fundamental questions of life. What's the meaning of life? What's the purpose of living? How to enrich life? What can we expect life will give us? In the most fundamental sense of satisfaction and identity and a sense of being a part of something larger than ourselves. I don't think those concerns will ever really go away. And for that reason, I think religion is here to stay.
The Way We Live is a 22-part series about sociology. For information on this program and accompanying materials, call 1-800-576-2988 or visit us online.